after that, you transitioned over to publishing, and how did that come to be? Because you ended up at Top Cow.
Yeah. So the Top Cow job came from my work at Diamond. So when I was in the purchasing department for 5 years, and I worked with publishers of all sizes. So some of my early accounts were like Oni Press, and I worked with Jeff Smith over at Cartoon Books, and Dave Sim at Aardvark Vanheim. And so those were kind of like the smaller independent publishers that had been there for a long time. And then the longer I was there, the more I was able to kind of work up to larger accounts. So I had Dynamite Entertainment when Iguchi first started that. And then same thing with Image Comics. I eventually got as an account. That was my biggest account.
That's one of the top Image. I mean, at the time, I don't know if it was, but they had gone through a rise and a fall at that time, right?
Yeah, it was still a premier publisher, but I think at that time they were very firmly number 4. So they were behind Dark Horse.
Okay.
Jim Valentino was the publisher over there at the time, and then about halfway through the time I was there, it switched over to Eric Larson. So this was like the era where they had like the Red Star and Powers, and I'm trying to think some of the other hits at the time, but they were really trying to figure out like
what their brand is.
Right, exactly. And then Eric Larson came in and injected some new energy into that, into their publishing line, and eventually Eric Stevenson took over.
Yep, and that's who's still there.
Right. And so through that relationship with Image is how I met Matt Hawkins, who's the president over at Top Cow, who you've talked to.
Yeah.
Top Cow has always been, well, that's not true. There was a period of time where they weren't part of Image.
Yeah.
Very briefly. And since then, because they're a partner studio, and they had this time where they had left Image and came back, I think Mark Silvestri always wanted to kind of have an infrastructure that could operate independently of Image and could interact with all the main partners. And so like back then, Matt was the only like partner studio where he would actually, Top Cow would contact Diamond directly and
oh wow,
coordinating with Image, but like Matt always wanted to have a direct line.
That's fascinating.
Yeah,
because a lot of comic book publishers that are Image is the big central brand, but there's so many different smaller publishers like Skybound, and all of them, it felt like they give their stuff to Image. So it's interesting to hear that there's actually a different level to that as well with Top Cow.
Yeah, and I think it may have changed over the years. I think now Matt and Mark are much more comfortable with Eric and
the way things are run,
seat and
of course,
how it's run. But the other thing that's important to remember, because a lot of people forget, there was a period of time where like Top Cow was Image's biggest revenue driver and like was the hottest brand.
Oh yeah,
within
Witchblade and the Darkness,
Tomb Raider, Battle of the Planets. All those books launched at number 1.
Yep.
And sold really well. Wanted was huge.
Yep.
And so anyway, I'd gotten to know Matt, and he called me up one day and said, "Hey, have you ever thought about leaving Diamond?" And I told him, I was like, "Yeah, of course. It'd be great to get into the publishing side again." It's like, in the back of my head, you're still kind of thinking about like, oh, like if I ever want to be creative, I need to be on that side.
Of course,
business, right? And even that job in the purchasing department was kind of me looking at like, how do I build a deeper network?
How do I get into that other side, and how do I get to do what I love, which is drawing and dealing with comic books
and creating stuff.
Of course.
And but what was funny was at that time I had just I think bought a house. Like literally I was closing on a house in Maryland.
Oh wow.
And Top Cow's based in Los Angeles, and I said, like I'd love to, but like I can't move. I'm like signing paperwork in the next week. And this would just be a disaster if I left. And he said, okay, and he thought about it, and then he hit me back up, and he's like, well, what if you could work remote? And I remember thinking to myself, well, even if this is like the worst decision I ever make, it's like I get to step into publishing, I get to work out of my house, which I've never done before, and I get to really kind of shift the direction of my career. And turned out to be like one of the best moves I ever made. I'm really grateful to Matt for reaching out to me, and and I started there as the vice president of marketing, which was really exciting. What's funny is I had a decent amount of experience with marketing at Diamond,
Of course.
but I had never been trained as
A marketing person.
professional. So like I had never written a press release. I had never pitched a story to a news outlet.
It's so funny you say that, because when Matt came on the show, he was talking the same thing, and he said, I went up to Rob Liefeld and I had never written a press release before, so I just showed up. I was in line waiting for him at a signing, and that's how he got his job too. He had never done any of that stuff. Yeah. And then Ross Ritchie as well, who's the CEO of Boom. He walked up to a booth at Comic-Con and he said, "Hey, listen, I noticed you shot this on 35 millimeter." So it's so interesting how there's people don't get into it and go, "Oh, I want to be in marketing." It just kind of happens that way sometimes.
I think often, and I think it's because comics is such a niche industry still. Like I think it's really driven by passion.
Absolutely.
Predominantly. And so, one of the hiring philosophies here at Boom, and it's something that I definitely felt when I was at Top Cow, is that it's better to hire for the person. Right. So like what you want to hire for is you want to hire for work ethic. You want to hire for intelligence, for the ability to communicate. And my joke with marketing is it's not rocket science.
Yeah.
Like if you have decent communication skills and you're able to think strategically and you're willing to learn, like anybody can do it. And that's not to say that we don't have some incredible professionals in the industry, or that like a marketing background or like a formal education that isn't helpful. But I just think that, at the end of the day, it's about who you are, how you interact with other
Absolutely.
people. And it's the hardest thing to kind of communicate to people that are aspiring coming in. Is like, well, what are the steps I need to follow to break into comics? Or what are the steps I need to do to get this job? And the reality is that
it's a time thing. You have to put in the time, you have to build the networking, and you have to hone your craft. I mean, those are the things that are hard to communicate.
Have to want to work with you.
Of course.
Right? Like I always say, like we spend 40 plus hours a week with these folks.
You don't have a bad apple in here that's going to ruin your mood and get the whole office down, and there's no one who would want to hire that person because
no matter how talented they are.
Exactly. Because you're around them. You want to have somebody who's going to lift you up and brighten your energy.
These are going to be some of the biggest, most impactful relationships of your day-to-day life.